Let's now look at the confirmation bias. There is a high level of polarization between supporters and opponents of Mr. Donald Trump in the US and Mr. Modi in India. Supporters and detractors often try hard to provide evidence supporting their views. However, contrary evidence seems to only harden and polarize opinions further. Why is neither side able to convince the other? Why do discussions and evidence result in further polarization? Why is it that logic and evidence fail to convince? Psychologists have studied this phenomenon and found that once we have formed a belief about something, we tend to seek out information that confirms our beliefs and filter out or reject any information that contradicts it. This cognitive bias has been called the confirmation bias. In 1979, Lord, Ross, and Lepper conducted a study to see if people change their opinions in the face of contrary evidence. They recruited 48 students, half of whom believed that the death penalty was a good deterrent to future crime, while the other half was against the death penalty and doubted its effectiveness as a deterrent. Both groups were given two carefully prepared studies, one providing data supporting the view that the death penalty was a deterrent and the other supporting the view that it was not. They were also provided with critiques of each study listing out the deficiencies. Those who initially supported the death penalty ended up with even greater conviction in the position, and the group opposing the death penalty also ended up with greater conviction in their position that the death penalty was not a deterrent. This is because each only looked for evidence that supported their own belief and completely ignored any evidence that contradicted it. This tendency to only look for information that supports our own belief while rejecting or downplaying conflicting information is the confirmation bias in play. This particular cognitive bias leads to many errors in decision making and also creates sharp divides amongst people. The confirmation bias, combined with AI-based social media engines, is fueling and strengthening differences between sections of society. For instance, if I believe that Trump is the great leader, social media will flood me with a constant stream of news and articles which confirm this view. A Trump detractor, on the other hand, will be fed similar volumes of news and articles that are not complementary to Trump. The constant stream of confirming information only strengthens our particular beliefs and creates an unbridgeable divide. This cognitive bias could be a good explanation for why we as a society are more sharply divided than ever before, even over trivial and not so important issues. Let's take a hypothetical situation where I make up a rule for a sequence of numbers and I tell you that the numbers 2, 4, 6 satisfy the rule. You're then asked to guess the rule I'm applying to generate the sequences. You have to figure out what the rule is by asking me to confirm or deny sequences of numbers you generate based on your hypothesis of what the rule is. This was an actual experiment conducted by Vass in 1960 to understand how people proceed in testing hypotheses. Participants in Vasson's experiment tended to try and confirm a hypothesis rather than trying to falsify it. They framed the hypothesis to start with and tried to propose more sets of 3 numbers to satisfy this rule. In this case, they tried numbers such as 4, 8, 10, 6, 8, 12, 20, 22, 24. And the feedback was positive that the number sequences satisfied the rule. After several rounds of testing, the participants were satisfied that the hypothesis was correct and stopped testing. However, when the participants stated the rule they had in mind, which was even numbers, they were told that the rule was wrong. The rule was simply increasing numbers. Instead of attempting to disprove the hypothesis, the goal of the experiment subjects was solely to validate it. Essentially, they were just seeking to confirm their answer instead of trying to falsify the hypothesis, which would have actually increased the likelihood of their arriving at the correct rule. If they had proposed odd numbers such as 3, 5 and 7, they would have been informed that those numbers also fulfilled the rule, thereby increasing the chances of discovering the correct rule. It's always a good practice to attempt to falsify a hypothesis wherever feasible. During the Salem witch trials in the late 1600s, people in Salem, Massachusetts became convinced that witches were among them and responsible for various afflictions. This belief led to the arrest and trial of many and ultimately the execution of 20 people. The judges and accusers were so convinced of the guilt of the accused that they only sought evidence that supported the belief and disregarded any evidence that did not. This is an example of the confirmation bias where people seek out and interpret information in a way that supports their pre-existing beliefs and ignore or reject information that contradicts them. The confirmation bias can also occur in scientific research, such as in medical studies. In these studies, researchers may have a preconceived notion of the results they want to see and may unconsciously seek out and interpret data in a way that confirms their hypothesis. For example, If a researcher believes that a particular drug is effective in treating a disease, they may be more likely to only publish or emphasize positive results and ignore or downplay negative results. This can lead to a skewed view of the efficacy of the drug and lead to potentially harmful treatment decisions which are based on incomplete or biased information. The confirmation bias can play out as a confirming evidence trap in decision making. This occurs when someone is focusing on finding evidence that confirms their pre-existing beliefs and ignore or discount any evidence that contradicts those beliefs. The confirming evidence trap can be particularly dangerous in decision making because it can lead to flawed judgments and decisions. For example, if a manager believes that a particular employee is not performing well, they may only seek out information that confirms the belief, such as negative feedback from co-workers, and ignore any positive feedback or evidence that contradicts the belief. This can lead to the employee being unfairly evaluated and possibly disciplined or terminated. Another example could be a politician who holds a strong belief about a particular policy and only seeks out information that confirms the belief, while ignoring or downplaying information that contradicts it. This can lead to a lack of nuance in policy making and lead to potentially harmful decisions for the constituents they represent. How can we mitigate the confirmation bias? Experts have suggested some ways we can mitigate the judgment errors arising from the confirmation bias. One effective way to reduce confirmation bias is to intentionally seek out information that contradicts the existing beliefs. This can be challenging and uncomfortable, but it can help us develop a more well-rounded perspective. Another way to combat confirmation bias is to consider alternative perspectives. This can involve seeking information from people who have different views or simply trying to imagine how someone with an opposing viewpoint might see things. We can be open-minded. Being open-minded means being receptive to new ideas and perspectives. By keeping an open mind, we can avoid dismissing information that contradicts our beliefs and remain open to changing our viewpoints. We should avoid jumping to conclusions. The confirmation bias can lead us to jump to conclusions based on limited information. To avoid this, it's important to gather as much information as possible before making a decision or drawing a conclusion. Finally, in conclusion, the confirmation bias is a cognitive bias that can have negative effects on decision making and create sharp divides amongst people. It is important to be aware of this bias, and we should always actively seek out credible information that challenges our existing beliefs.